Hello, and welcome to another benchmarking video. Today we're going to be talking about iRacing and VR. Ooh, I know you guys have been waiting for this. Took a while to get here. But first of all, thank you to the new subscribers. We've got 100 new subscribers since the last video. Super cool. If you didn't know already, I'm trying to get 1,000 subs. And when I do, I'm going to go out and I'm going to get the latest Radeon 7000 series, maybe a 7900 XTX or 7800 XT, something. I'm going to test triples. I'm going to test VR with it. Okay, back to today. We've got rain in iRacing. This has been a long-awaited update. We've all been anticipating it. Now, with iRacing, they're always updating their software, their new features. We've already seen a hot fix come out. There's going to be more in the future. So this isn't going to be a deep dive analysis into rain and VR because that's just going to be a moving target. So the performance you see today might not be relevant to what's going to be on offer next month, for example. But what I will talk about is the different process that I have. If you see my previous videos, you're probably familiar with the bar charts. And in these charts, I'm showing the average FPS, the minimum 1% and sometimes 0.2% lows. And when I did my video for the Quest 3 a few months ago when it first came out in iRacing, I also used that bar chart approach. Now this presents an issue for VR because with a VR headset, you're always going to have a fixed refresh rate and you're going to want to attain that FPS for that headset. So for example, the valve index can do 90 Hertz. If I'm running a 90 Hertz refresh rate in the headset, I also want to have 90 FPS constantly. If you don't have that, that's when you run into some issues. These are going to look like frame stutters, jittering of the visual image, because when the headset is requesting to display a new image, it is delayed in getting there. And as a result, it has to regurgitate the previous frame instead of present you a black empty frame. And so that's what creates the stutter. So if we're trying to avoid stutters, we're trying to get a consistent frame time, what happens if my testing scenario is able to be achieved by all of the graphics cards or all of the CPUs being tested? Now, if I present to you a chart that looks like this, how useful is that? What we're seeing here is basically identical performance from these CPUs. Only the 1% and 0.2% minimums suggest there is a difference. The X3D chips are also in this group too, and my results from other videos has shown an advantage to them. Clearly, one of these is better than the other, but this graphical representation of it is not sufficient. Today's VR analysis is going to be with Steam VR and a valve index. It's actually over here, situated on my Angry Bird, which is great for enabling the headset, by the way. Keeps it in one place. I'm using the OpenXR runtime with Steam VR because it gives me access to a few different features, one of which is fpsVR. Now, this is a Steam VR application that you can buy for just a few dollars, and it's going to provide an on-screen overlay that will provide real-time data analysis so that you can actually see where your performance is being affected by a component or vice versa. And then you're also going to be able to export those results into a viewer, and that viewer is going to show you far more detailed analysis about your benchmark or that gaming session that you just had. So what does FPS VR look like in the headset? Well, I stuck my phone in there and I took this footage. I joined a race session as a ghost because, as you can see, I'm driving on the monitor while not wearing the headset, so my perspective is terrible. I cannot see the puddles. The VR headset is to my left, and I tried to block the light, but it doesn't matter. Capturing footage of the LCD screens or OLEDs inside a VR headset is very difficult. The camera has a hard time focusing, but try to look past all of that if you can, and you can see the moving bar graph that's going by. On the left, it's showing GPU frame time, and on the right is CPU frame time, and you can see issues. Anything orange is late. It's not showing up on time. If I were wearing the headset, those would be stutters. Now, it's difficult to make it out, but there is a reprojection ratio shown as a percentage in the bottom left of that fpsVR overlay. In Steam VR terminology, reprojection is called motion smoothing. In the Meta world or Oculus system, it's called asynchronous warp. And it's the same idea where synthetic frames are used to smooth out the viewing experience. In order to do this, the frame rate itself has to be limited. So if you're at 90 frames per second, it will decrease that to 45. Now, when it comes to VR benchmarking, I have to disable motion smoothing. Otherwise, I'm not going to get real results. What I want to see is the raw performance delivered by the CPU and the GPU, something that allows me to compare each one to the next. If I left it enabled, it would be the same idea of leaving G-Sync or V-Sync enabled when you're looking at 2D performance on monitors. So for example, if I was at Roscogan where we had over 300 FPS with the 4080 Super, if we had G-Sync or V-Sync enabled, it would take the chart from looking like this and it would switch it to looking like this. And that's actually quite disingenuous to the performance that can be offered here from that video card. Yes, it is maybe more practical because you would probably use G-Sync or V-Sync in your sim racing. Should you be using motion smoothing or async warp with sim racing? You can, but you have to understand that there are certain graphical anomalies that are going to present themselves. And with iRacing and this rain update, there's actually one I didn't anticipate, and that's the windshield wiper. This thing really glitches out when you have motion smoothing on, and I managed to capture some footage of that. This is the same scene that I had previously shown, but this time I have motion smoothing enabled. At real-time speed, it's a little tricky to figure it out. When I slow it down, I think you can see the stickiness, this warp that is happening. Motion smoothing is trying to synthetically anticipate the movement, but it's too complicated. So if you're going to drive in the rain with motion smoothing, you should probably turn off your window wipers. So the goal with VR racing is always to have your hertz perfectly synced with your FPS. One and the same, running at the same undeterred rate. That is the goal. So this is where that nifty app fpsVR comes in, and it's able to show us performance that's occurring behind the scenes. How much headroom is there available to the CPU, to the GPU when we're doing this analysis? So let's look at a chart made from fpsVR data. I'm going to start with something easy. Just kind of like math class. I don't want to blow your mind with calculus right off the bat. Going across the bottom is the x-axis, which is showing frame time. Now, frame time is just like frames per second. In fact, it's calculated from it. It's 1,000 divided by FPS. If I'm running my headset at 120 hertz, my goal is 120 FPS, which means my targeted frame time is 8.3 milliseconds or less. So lower is better because the less time it takes to render, the faster it is running. And that's what's represented by the dashed red line. That is at 8.3 milliseconds. Everything to the left of that is delivered on time. And then anything to the right is late. So let's go ahead and add in the other frame time requirements for different headsets, such as 72 hertz, 80, 90, and then all the way to the experimental 144 hertz. If you want your driving experience to be smooth, you need all the data to be to the left of those lines, or whatever line your headset's running at. The y-axis represents the total percentage of time that each frame time occurred during the bench. I think this is best understood by using examples. This chart happens to be very pointy, and that peak represents 4.6 milliseconds on that x-axis. And when you look to the left, that crosses over at 15.3%. So in other words, during this benchmark, 15.3% of the time, the frame time was at 4.6 milliseconds. Because this is an area chart, the orange area actually accurately represents the performance in this scenario. So with another example, 50% of the frame time recorded is between 4.4 and 4.7 milliseconds. Now, these exact numbers aren't relevant, really, but I just want to describe them so you understand what you're looking at. Because the big takeaway is much more obvious, and that is 100% of the GPU workload is delivered in less than 8.3 seconds. It's delivered on time, and that's what matters the most. So that's how you read the chart. It's not difficult. It's pretty straightforward. And once you acquire the vision for it, it's very intuitive, I think. What is different, though, is the CPU chart. We're going to see it load up slightly differently. So let's talk about that now. The format of the chart is the same, but what's different is that now we're looking at CPU data. And we can easily see that the majority of the data shows the CPU was able to deliver its work on time. Unlike the GPU chart, we know that this is not 100% on time. But you know that because you can see this little tail going past that red dashed line. It's pretty hard to see, so I'll zoom in with it. Those data points, albeit small, represent 0.14% of this data. I mean, like, blink and you'll miss it. But if you happen to be staring at an apex at this time on the racetrack, it might come across as a stutter. CPU performance in iRacing, in VR, often has this trailing tail. And as you increase visual quality or add complexity to the scene, not only does it get longer, but it can get taller too. Some of you may have read the description at the bottom of the chart, and that describes the racing scenario that I have and the quality settings I had to turn off to achieve this performance for the sake of this example. So here's some footage of the replay that I use, taken from Algarve, or known as Portimao. It's a week 13 race, and clearly you can see it is very wet. I'm in the Porsche 911 GT3. And in this example, I have all the candy turned on. This was running on my Valve Index, but I just captured the mirror on the desktop. As per usual, I'll send this footage up to the top for your entertainment, but I will be having the data underneath. At the top of the screen, you can see the quality settings that I'm using. To the right, you can see some of the hardware setup. And then bottom left, this is the same data that we were just talking about, but I've combined the graphs. So the orange represents GPU and the CPU is the blue line. An easy way to illustrate what happens when you increase the CPU load is, well, add another mirror, and that's what I'll do here. Right away, we can see that blue tail go all the way out past 15 milliseconds. But the GPU area is largely unaffected. It is also drawn out slightly more to the right, but it's being pulled along by the delays in the CPU workload. The 911 GT3 is one of the few GT3 cars that has 4 mirrors, and if we engage all 4 mirrors in this replay, there is a huge impact to the CPU performance. The height of the CPU line suggests that a significant percentage of time is spent at each one of these frame times, maybe a quarter of a percentile, but if you add that up across 9, 10, 11, 12 milliseconds and onwards, that means we're going to have suboptimal performance. And it doesn't matter if we have 90 hertz, 80 hertz, 72 hertz, the CPU is unable to resolve this workload on time. And what's great about this chart is the visual showcase of how this affects the GPU. The tower that used to rise up to 15% at around the 5 millisecond mark has now kind of fallen over, and now there's a second hump, and it's peaking just before that red 120 hertz dashed line. To me, this suggests that the GPU is still able to turn around the work requested of it, but it is delayed in waiting for said work from the CPU. Okay, so let's try and apply some of this to the traditional bar graphs, and tell me what you think of this. The first chart with the orange bars represents the average FPS, and we know that's limited to 120, so we see 2 and 3 mirror configurations attain that, but with 4 mirrors, there's a slight dip to 117 FPS. And then the 2 graphs on the bottom, they just represent how much of the GPU time on the left or CPU time on the right is past that 120 hertz requirement. If it's past that 8.3 milliseconds, it's late. That's where that tail is. So notice how the average FPS is a little misleading. At 3 mirrors, we're at 120, and you'd think everything would be fine, but when it comes to the CPU frames, over 3% were late. So you could, 3% of the time, be discovering a stutter when in the headset. And the 117 frames per second average with 4 mirrors is very misleading to what percentage of frames were delivered, late. And in the bottom right, we see 34.8% were not on time. After recovering my car from the standing water up top, I'll change the FPS chart to the frames reprojected, and this is represented as a percentage. I'll be honest, I don't understand why it's at 18.7% for 4 mirrors when we know in the bottom right the CPU is delayed 34.8%. I don't know what that difference is, but when I find out, I'll tell you. What is clear that at these settings, the impact of using 4 mirrors to the CPU is significant. You would have to decrease other quality settings to try and salvage that performance. So you may be thinking, okay, what happens if we jack up all of the image quality settings? And let's see that now. When we turn on shadow maps, high quality mirrors, HDR, drawing all cars, and yeah, there's a big impact to performance here. I had to change the chart orientation just to get it to fit in here, landscape. And guess what? Things get worse when we go to 4 mirrors. This is a brutal testing scenario, and most of the data points are captured to the right of that red dashed line. So we're well beyond this hardware's ability to deliver 120 frames per second. If you're wondering what happens if we turn on motion smoothing, given this intense 4 mirror situation, well, here's the chart. Notice the dramatic change in the orange GPU part of the chart. Now the majority of it is delivered on time. The distribution of data for the blue CPU line has normalized somewhat. And while that blue tail is still there, it is much smaller than what we see in the chart below, where there is no motion smoothing. In the headset, the experience will be better with motion smoothing, but it is still exposed to those graphical anomalies. Flipping over to the bar charts for these 3 scenarios with 2 mirrors, 4 mirrors, and 4 mirrors with motion smoothing, we can see how the data represents itself slightly differently. With motion smoothing enabled, the overall FPS average does decrease. Keep in mind, it will half the frame rate and inject 50% synthetic frames when it's at risk to reprojection. Motion smoothing and this type of reprojection helps the GPU, and we see that down on the bottom left with the frames delivered on time. Without reprojection, it's at 35%, but when we enable this technology, it goes to 83%. Performance is ultimately limited by the CPU, and that's what we see over on the on-time scenario, where the difference between 4 mirrors with or without a motion reprojection is just a percent. It's nothing. Switching over to the reprojected ratio that is shown in fpsVR, I wanted to see if there's a difference between 4 mirrors and 4 mirrors with motion reprojection, and we see there is, but it's just a subtle 2% difference. So I think this chart and that metric is useful to evaluating how much motion reprojection would occur even when motion smoothing is disabled. And finally, here's a quick glance at wet versus dry performance. I wouldn't take too much stock in this. It's two different racing scenarios. One's an AI race, the other one was online. Yeah, so that kind of summarizes my approach to VR analysis and sim racing, at least with iRacing. I plan to use Steam VR because I can get more granular data with this FPS VR application. I'm going to reach out to the developer to make sure I'm using it correctly, that my analysis is accurate. And then the other thing is I'm probably going to wait until the first patch to come out with this new Tempest system with iRacing before I do big CPU and GPU analysis, only because I expect there to be a lot of bug fixes and efficiency gains. So I'm going to wait until that because I want to make sure I present to you relevant data. Anyway, thanks for watching.